Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome you to the seventh edition of the Epic India Dialogue series, which is being hosted in partnership with the International Council on Clean Transportation. The Epic India Dialogue is a flagship series that convenes experts and enthusiasts to come and discuss India's leading issues at the intersection of energy, environment, and climate. In the past, we have had dialogues that has discussed energy transition, net zero pathways, climate communications and narrative building, urban risks and public health, methane mitigation, and climate equity. Today, we have gathered to discuss one such important issue, which is on roads emissions in Delhi NCR, the role it plays in the rising pollution levels, and the severe impact it has on the health of the citizens. We will discuss how gaps in the standards have been set and the on road real world emissions, where the current data is revealing, and the recommendations by our esteemed speakers, Mr. Amit Bhatt, Managing Director India for ICCT India, and Dr. Kaushik Deb, Executive Director Epic India. I would also like to extend a warm welcome to everyone who has joined us. You have already made it a success by being here. On this note, I would like to invite the moderator for this conversation, Shravan Engineer, who is the project manager at Epic India, where he works at the intersection of transport policy and clean mobility. He supports the design and implementation of electric mobility and clean transport initiatives, working closely with government partners to strengthen policy and on ground delivery. Please join us. And I hope everyone has a good time and looking forward to interesting conversation today. Thank you.
Good evening, everyone. So I'm going to briefly introduce the speakers today. And personally, I've learned a lot from both of them. Amit, I'm sure you might not remember me, but I start off a little formally. Amit is the India Managing Director for ICCT. He has 20 plus years of experience in the industry already. For the longest of time that I knew or read about him, he was at WRI leading the transport vertical. Now, why you won't remember? So I was at the department when we were discussing the public charging tender. The insight that I have here is that we had multiple meetings at the Delhi Transco Limited, the DDC, the Transport Department, Power Department, and I've seen him as being one of the architects, and pun intended there, as of the public charging tender that we have, which is, I guess, till now, one of the largest public charging tenders in the country, one of the most successful ones as well. Well, in all those conversations, everyone used to circle back to you and be like, Amit ji, bataiye ab kya kare? And I'm sure it's no different even today. It's because of your relentless efforts, not only in Delhi, but across the sector, that we are where we are, and we are progressing at a much faster pace. Amit, I welcome you here. Kaushik, I'm going to keep it a little brief for you, but I still have something. So, yeah, as you all know, Kaushik is the Executive Director at Epic India, an applied economist having 25 years plus worth of experience. Now, what I have for you is, before I joined Epic last year in January, I had a conversation with one of my friends, and I was like, I'm thinking of joining Epic. And his one question was, who's leading the organization right now? I said, yeah, it's Kaushik Deb. There was a 2 second pause, and in those 2 seconds, I could imagine everything, but not what he said. He said, Shravan, aankh band karke join kar, you'll have the best time there. And I'm living my best time right now. So yeah, Kaushik, please. I jump straight to it. I'm not going to preach to the choir that Delhi has a problem. Transport has been those persistent sort of pain points for a very long time. I saw in one of your podcasts with my dear friend Priyadarshi, you had mentioned that we do have one-offs like say Diwali or the stubble burning, but transport has been consistently the pain point. So having said that, there have been enough steps taken, in my opinion, at least till recently, in terms of jumping from BS4 to BS6, or even for that matter, tightening the emission norms like the proposed CAFE 3 that we might soon see, or changing the drive cycle very recently. Now, on paper, the direction is very clear. We have the intent, but it's about what is really happening on ground. And this is where I turn to one of your sort of, in my opinion at least, the groundbreaking studies that was on remote sensing. Uh, Now, what does that data really say, Amit? And how are these numbers really translating on ground that we have on lab compliance and then what is happening on ground.
Thanks, Shravan. Very interesting. So, I think one is that if you look at us as a country and Delhi specifically as a region, we have actually done quite significant work on looking at emission from transport. So, the whole transition from BS4 to BS6, I mean, is a case study in itself. None of the countries have done bypassing BS5. Similarly, the whole CNG transition that happened in Delhi was also unparalleled. I mean, so it's not that we have not done, we have done some phenomenal work. But having said that, air quality still remains a major issue, right? So the question is, why is it so? Even after doing so much work, it's still transport, which is the single most important, largest contributor for air quality in Delhi NCR. And so there are a couple of things. One, so we wanted to understand that, what is the emission from transport when vehicles are under operation? So, I mean, you know that very well. So you have a type approval, and then you have when vehicles come on road, they undergo through this sometimes once in 6 months, in some places once every year, of PUC, which is pollution under control, right? And there are a lot of issues. So if you look at the whole history of PUC, it was devised about 2-3 decades back when the fight against pollution was against the visible smoke.
Precisely.
Now, a lot of technology development has happened. I don't think modern vehicles emit any visible smoke. It's all invisible. But we still continue relying on that technology. So if you have, let's say, a petrol or CNG vehicle, you are measuring carbon monoxide emission, you are measuring hydrocarbon emissions. Or if you have, let's say, a diesel vehicle, you are doing something called a smoke density test, which is loosely how black is the smoke, right? Now, so that's one. So we wanted to understand what is the emission when these vehicles are under operation. Second, we also wanted to understand, okay, what is the emission when it comes to criteria pollutants? So whole debate on air quality in Delhi is about PM 2.5. But PUC does not measure PM 2.5. The debate is on what is the NOx emission, but PUC is not measuring NOx emission. So when you are not measuring, the question is how will you manage, right? So we, along with support from Delhi Transport Department as well as Gurgaon District Administration, we bought this remote sensing equipment. And over 6 months, at about 18 locations, we tested this equipment with actual real-world operation. So idea was to capture different criteria pollutants when the vehicles are in operation. Because you have to understand the air quality that impacts us is the air quality that comes when these vehicles are under operation, not when they are parked at your or mine home, right? So with that, when we did the analysis and some of the findings that came out, we were actually shocked because there are some things which were very, very interesting. So one, we found that the transition from BS4 to BS6 has reduced emission, and now we have data to prove that this transition was very important. Second, we found that the real world emission is very different from lab values. And it is very different for all the major criteria pollutants. Third, we found that even with the difference and the BS6 coming down, even in some categories of BS6, the real world was higher than lab value.
I could see the NOx emissions were a lot higher.
Exactly.
Yeah.
The fourth important point we found was that even for the same category of vehicles, there was different emissions with different OEMs.
Right.
So we did not name the OEMs in the report, but again. And last was that this whole narrative of CNG being clean is also not, that needs a revisit, because the CNG vehicles may have a lower particulate matter emission, but they have a very, very high NOx emission. And in fact, in some cases, we found that emission to be as high as 25 times the prescribed limit.
Right.
Now, you have to understand the NOx is responsible for secondary particulate matter formation. So in total, what we concluded was, one, we have to better understand emission. We have to better understand real-world emission. We have to relook at the emission testing methodology. And lastly, we have to aggressively look at the emission solution because you have to understand that whatever may be the share of transport in ambient air quality, 40, 45, 50%, depending on what study you take, the real issue is that when you are on a major intersection or a road, you are breathing pollutants which are much higher in exposure than what is the ambient air quality. So cleaning transport is very important for public health, and that's the message that we wanted to drive through this publication.
No, I mean, great study actually. I went through it, and few of the numbers that were put out in the study. Kaushik, now because we have this in our hands, like the numbers and what is really happening on ground, what I want to ask you is when all these numbers and all these data points, you know, analysis come into the policy space, where does it really lose traction? I mean, is it the design that we need to rework, the enforcement, or is it the institutional follow through that's sort of missing there?
Thanks, Shravan. Let me kind of start by thanking Amit and ICCT for this partnership. We truly, truly believe that by working together, especially in the research and policy analysis space, we are a lot stronger in being able to influence policy and make change happen. And in that, kind of the leadership that ICCT has shown over the last many years, Amit, personally, you heard Shravan's story, right? Has kind of been a very spectacular, not just a thought leader, but actually someone who's made impact. So very grateful for this partnership. And also Shravan for pointing out that Epic India now is party central. So if you want to have a good time, that's where you should be. So I'm trained as an economist, not as an engineer, not as a scientist, right? The bit that I have learned ever since I moved from the school to the real world is that the real world is a very special case. And getting stuff implemented that is very well established in science or in theory is much, much harder because of this piece that we call policy change. We may have had overwhelming evidence of a particular trend that should lead us to in a particular direction. Case in point, remote sensing telling us that the way to measure emissions on the road is not through outdated 4-decade-old technology approach that is a pollution under control piece. But getting this change happen in the law, and for that to actually make a difference to the emission profile for in-use vehicles is a much harder ask, right? Part of it is classic chicken and egg. Do we have enough studies to be able to design the regulations so that this could be brought in as a regulatory reform and move forward from what we currently have for measuring emissions from in-use vehicles? There will never be enough evidence that will satisfy every stakeholder in every constituency for any change. But that always is an argument that's kind of put forth, which is my way of very gently signaling the need for political will to kind of get this change made. The second part of this exercise also is that you did this work in Delhi in a particular context. This experiment has been ongoing. And when you're doing something for 10 years, I don't know why you still call it an experiment, has been ongoing in Kolkata for, you
Roughly about 15 years now.
There you go. A significant part of my career, right? You have enough evidence that you could kind of try and think about this more cleverly or kind of more institutionally. India is not Delhi or Kolkata. Do you kind of have enough evidence from other geographies that will satisfy every stakeholder and make that policy change happen? It's much harder to kind of get that done. So this policy inertia piece is a very significant roadblock for any reform. And in the end, a large part of that is solved through political will.
Right.
And in many ways, at least in the transport sector in Delhi, we've learned that this political will has been exercised not by the politicians, but by the judiciary, which is kind of an interesting case study by itself. Now take a step back, right? We have a potential reform that could be transformative in terms of how we assess emissions from in-use vehicles. We were earlier speaking about this end-of-life strategy that we have, that it's based on the vintage of a vehicle, which may or may not reflect its emission profile. A lot of us who have very well-maintained old cars or any other vehicle might argue that why are we being penalized for our great behavior when these idiots with a 2-year-old vehicle but with very poor maintenance or very high utilization rate are having a terrible emissions performance? And that's a valid argument. And that's a valid argument that most cases would be legally justifiable as well. But we have political will in our country being exercised by the judiciary, which makes it a lot more complicated. There is. So, what is it that we have on the plate that we can do right now? Our PUCC regime. How can we kind of make that stronger? How can we make that more effective? And how can we make sure that at least that enforcement is responsible for whatever little it can achieve? And some of the work that we've done kind of shows that even that very primitive, very limited monitoring regime can have fairly chunky impacts. So we've carried out a randomized control trial survey over the last few months now,
Yep.
where we've kind of tested what would be the emissions performance if the PUC test was actually carried out properly as opposed to not, across a variety of vintage, in this case defined as Bharat stages of vehicles between fuels. And we see that the results show that if the test is carried out correctly, the emission performance for the correct test is significantly much worse than if the test is not carried out correctly, which makes sense, right? You are able to kind of catch many more vehicles not meeting the standard if you're doing the test properly. We also saw some very, very interesting things. That a vehicle turns up at a PUC center. We record that in our survey as having turned up at the PUC center, but does not appear in the records of the PUC center. And at some point in the future turns up at another PUC center or at the same PUC center and passes the test. There's something happening there, right? I mean, data does not lie. When we put all of this together, it is a very significant impact. One of the pieces of research that the University of Chicago is responsible for is the Air Quality Life Index that translates the air quality index that's observed against what is the WHO recommended standard and what does that mean in terms of lives lost. We do this for the entire world. We do this for every geography in the world, and the numbers for India are really scary. I don't know if you've seen the AQI numbers this morning when you woke up, but if you're living in India, you're losing about 3 years of your life. But any guesses how many years of your life you're losing if you're living in Delhi?
8.2.
Wonderful. 8 years of your life. Even for an old man like me, it's a fairly chunky part of what I've been through. The PUC regime, implemented correctly, saves us about 6 months of our life. That's how I quantify that impact.
So, I mean, great insight that we could do the correlation between AQLI and how the tests really take place there. But Amit, I'm going to zoom out a little bit here. Now you spoke about the real world emissions that are happening on road. Kaushik spoke more about PUC, and you also mentioned that PUC does not really test carbon, hydrocarbon, and everything. Now, the reason that I'm zooming out, Delhi or any other metro city in the country, we face congestion, stop and goes, idling situations and everything. Now, having said that, how much of these real world conditions really impact the emissions compared to what they're certified to do? And this might lean more towards how they're tested, and be diving a little deeper into what just happened this week about WLTP testing cycle. Maybe you can touch upon it a little bit, and then yeah.
No, so also we also wanted to figure out that why a certain category of vehicle is emitting more in terms of its ownership, in terms of its usage. And then while we not very conclusive evidence, but there are very strong pointers. So for example, we found that commercial vehicles have higher emission for the same make of vehicle when it is put for a personal use.
Right.
So it could be because of abuse of vehicle, maybe overloading. There could be multiple reasons.
Yes.
Right? So the other interesting thing we found was we want to understand why CNG vehicles in commercial usage have elevated NOx emission. And we found one reason could be that a lot of these vehicles are retrofit. And when you are retrofitting the vehicle, you are really retrofitting it probably to get the higher mileage. And maybe that results in higher NOx emission.
Right.
So one is we have to first understand that when you are testing these vehicles, you may be testing these vehicles in an ideal or in a scenario where you are, so it's a controlled experiment, right?
Yes.
Because you really want to compare the same different vehicle category with the same, which is good, but then the impact on human health is when these vehicles are operating in the real world.
Yes.
So that is why you are seeing this recent shift which has happened in the WLTP cycle for emissions as well as for efficiency testing is more of reflecting what is the real world use case scenario. So that's one. But the other important thing is because, so one is that what do you do with the data that you get, right? And so, for example, Kaushik, you were saying that unless we change the PUC system, it will be difficult to kind of legally enforce something, right? And that change will take time. But the question is, what can this data drive us? So I'll give you an example. So the city of London used this remote sensing data very, I will say very smartly. They did a massive data collection and they found that of all the vehicle segment, the gross polluting vehicle category was the black cabs. Because the same vehicle in personal use was well within the limit, but the commercial use was way above the limit. And so they said, let's aggressively electrify the black cabs. So let's say if when the city starts generating all this data, and when you have these kinds of analysis, okay, which is the gross polluting vehicle in my city? And if let's say I am coming up with an EV policy, I will target that vehicle segment rather than a blanket distribution of funds to all the vehicle segments, right? So that's one you can use the data. Some of the countries have also used it to identify certain OEMs have a higher emission in the same vehicle category. Why that should be the case, right? So you can then actually target these OEMs specifically saying that, look, your vehicle of the same make has much higher emission compared to your peers. Is there something wrong with the vehicle? Can you fix it? So I think this data gives us a very, very interesting insight, which can be used for decision-making processes. Because again, that requires a shift. Yes, for controlled experiment, you need a condition where you can measure, but ultimately it's the real world which impacts us. And how do you bring that real world data in policy formulation? That is going to be key.
Got it. Now, I'm going to stick with you for a while here. And the reason is we spoke about testing, we spoke about WLTP, and I read a few articles and a couple of research papers as well on CAFE norms and about WLTP. Could you help us break down what exactly is CAFE norms, how is it going to impact, and what exactly is WLTP, the cycle that we are now moving towards?
So CAFE stands for Corporate Fuel Efficiency Standards. Is basically a fuel efficiency standards for light duty vehicles, which is normally as you call cars, right? So it's a regulation that looks at efficiencies of cars, but not at a particular model level, at a corporate level.
Right.
So let's say if I am an OEM X, you are an OEM Y, we have a corporate level target of Z. So how do I address that target? Let's say if certain vehicle category has higher emission. Let's say I have a lot of SUV in my product, right? So SUVs tend to have higher emission. Now, what do? I might sell more. So even I can reduce the fuel consumption of these vehicles to bring down the fuel consumption, or I can sell more smaller vehicles or more electric vehicles. So at a corporate level, I meet the target. Now, why is this important for us? Two reasons. So one, if you look at the G20 which happened in India, we committed for doubling fuel energy efficiency by 2030. And that includes vehicles as well. So that's one. Secondly, if you have a CAFE standards which is stringent enough, you are also giving kind of direction to the industry to improve.
Right.
And so you can use these standards to actually change technology. So for example, when Europe says the CO2 standards will be 0 gram CO2 per kilometer, Now you cannot meet 0 gram with internal combustion engine. So they are not saying you have to shift to electric,
But they're implying.
they are implying. So you can use these standards to kind of look at the
Right.
technology penetration. Now, India currently has a standard of about 113 grams CO2,
Right.
which is based on an MIDC cycle. So MIDC is a typically very loose, not a very realistic representation of real world driving habits. And once you change to WLTP cycle, which the country has committed from 1st April 27, the fuel consumption will go up because that is more reflective of the real world driving. And Europe has shown that it will reduce or it will increase the fuel consumption by almost anywhere between 16 to 17%.
Okay.
Because you will test the vehicles at different speed,
Right.
at different drivetrains, and that's all. So the question is, where do we want? So what is the benefit of a stringent CAFE regulation? I said, you can change the product, you can change the technology, you can also help OEMs think differently.
Yeah.
And then, because this will lead to reduction in fuel consumption, you can save a lot of foreign exchange. Because, I mean, Kaushik will know it well. A lot of petroleum products we import from outside, and there's a massive foreign exchange. So it's a way to modernize the transport system. And one way is to modernize is by giving subsidies, which we have been doing for
Right.
a lot of time. But you can also modernize by using regulations, which does not require subsidy, because then it creates a level playing field for everyone to comply. Either you improvise or you sell more electric. So it's a pathway for OEMs for compliance.
Right. You know, I'm particularly, in my whatever limited experience that I have till now, the reason that I'm particularly a little excited about we moving to WLTP is in 21, when we were thinking about amendments to the Delhi EV policy. We had thought that, we might only give incentives to vehicles that are tested on the WLTP drive cycle. But very advanced conversations with ARAI, ICAT, even more at one point of time. But then we figured, and all of this was because the auto rickshaws that Delhi had launched that year, the claimed range was somewhere around 150, but the real world range was roughly about 90 or 100. And that sort of got us thinking that, we need to do something. But didn't happen nonetheless. It's at least here now. Kaushik, this is more from your economics perspective and the urban growth that we are seeing right now. No doubt that Delhi is growing rapidly. Vehicles are coming on road like left, right, and center. We have seen the numbers from Vahan. Freight is also increasing a lot more. Are we at the risk of locking in, say, these emission patterns that we are seeing right now, which might be a little difficult to reverse in the coming few decades?
So I'll do a classic economist's thing on one hand and on the other. So the answer is yes and no. The transformation that's happening in the vehicle fleet today is almost as dramatic in terms of electrification, is almost as dramatic as happened in the horizon 1999 to 2001, the shift from diesel to CNG in Delhi's vehicle fleet, and then kind of that essentially being scaled up to a large part of urban India. And what we are doing right now with electrifying 2 and 3 wheelers, such a large and overwhelming part of our vehicle fleet, buses, such a high mileage of our entire vehicle kilometers, is possibly one of the biggest experiments of this kind that's happening anywhere in the world, maybe apart from China. So there is a technology change that's happening, which is very, very dramatic. It's not fast enough because clearly when we go out and breathe
Right.
the air, it's not solving that problem completely. The technology lock-in, I think, that's more important is in terms of the increase in motorization in general. And how far can we go down the route of buying more cars and two-wheelers and personal mobility vehicles that that truly will be on the road for many, many years. Certainly not decades, given how we define the end-of-life policies here. But that technology lock-in is a significant one because that lock-in also has implications for urban infrastructure.
Right.
And what we need to build to service that vehicle fleet. And that shift is a lot more dramatic in terms of its impact on transport sector emissions. Uh, for the longest time, in most modeling exercises, especially linear modeling, the easiest thing was to kind of bring about a certain shift from personal to public transport, and that would have an impact in terms of emissions magnifold than that particular shift itself called for. But there are a variety of issues in terms of personal costs, public costs, and who bears the cost of that transition and how would that work. And that's something that we've seen kind of as a live experiment happening in Delhi as we build this really extensive rail system, possibly the best in the world right now, but at a true enormous cost in terms of congestion that's happening right now on Delhi streets. That lock-in in motorization and personal vehicles is, I think, a lot more significant. And that's the shift that would be important because, for all intents and purposes, as a country, we've defined zero emission vehicles to also include some vehicles that use fossil fuels. Now, that's a kind of interesting definition. How are you zero emission when you're using fossil fuels? I've never heard of carbon capture and sequestration on top of a bus, but maybe that exists somewhere in the world, which means that there will be, for a very, very long time, emissions coming from the tailpipe on vehicles that are moving on the road. The lab is a very special case and does not mirror what's happening in the real life. And that's really code for saying that we have a lot more congestion on the road, hence driving speeds are suboptimal, and emissions and fuel consumption as a result is higher. OEMs sometimes try to solve for fuel efficiency at the cost of emissions, and that has an even more perverse impact. But if we were to solve the real world to mirror the lab a lot more closely by having congestion dealt with in a manner that allows for vehicles to be driven optimally, you are able to slice away another part of the emissions problem from in-use vehicles. And that's where there are kind of a couple of things that are really, really important. The price that you pay to be able to access the road transport network, especially the road transport network. The second is your ability to own a vehicle to be able to access that road transport network. And if on top of all of this, we were able to kind of add the cost of externalities coming out of transport sector emissions, very importantly, health, you have a very, very strong case where the social cost of this transformation is significantly overwhelmed by the benefits that would come about from this. And it's a question of asking the government to be able to capture it. As a country, the one reason why China is so far ahead in such a variety of activities and sectors is because, as a government, they've seemingly done away with the financial rate of return and the economic rate of return. If anything makes sense, they just go ahead and do it. Our policy-making process is extremely adversarial, where there is actual competition between government and the private sector, and sometimes the think tank world, for rent. And this competition leads to the kind of policy inertia that I was talking about earlier. So if we don't want to get locked into a transport sector that drives us to, a situation like the London smog of the 1960s or LA air quality in the 1970s, we need to make the transformation now. And we have a very short window.
Right.
We probably, if we don't do this in the next couple of years or so, especially in Delhi, a lot of us should seek to move out.
Well, I'll pick out one point you mentioned about electrification, and no conversation for me can be over without talking about it. I was reading your colleague Murthy Nair's study on LCVs the other day, and I read that 2% electrification in that category had immense impact on what emissions are being put out by that particular vehicle segment. Now, what do you think about the electrification? Like Kaushik mentioned, the transformation needs to be quick. How do we really do it? Just few words there.
No, absolutely. And I think if you look at global kind of stories for electrification, there are two ways you can electrify, right? So let's step back. So what is the biggest problem with electric vehicles? As a consumer, The biggest problem is they are expensive than ICE.
Yeah.
And so in two-wheeler, maybe 20, 35%.
Yes.
In cars, maybe 50, 56% or 60%. In buses, maybe 3 times, 2 times. Trucks, around same. How do I bring down the cost of the vehicle? So the government will say, here's the subsidy.
Right.
You take the subsidy and the cost comes down. Now, this works initially because you are bringing a new technology. You really want people to take advantage of it. But we don't have enough money to subsidize all our fleet.
Fair.
Right? So how do you then reduce cost? Now so to reduce cost, you have to increase competition in the market.
Yes.
And to increase competition, you have to create demand in the market, right? And this is a classical case. If you look at Delhi, the whole CNG transition happened. Just till the day before the CNG was to be introduced, there were not buses, CNG, which were available. There were not dispensing infrastructure, which was available. And everyone said, it won't happen.
Yeah.
6 months down the line, the buses were there, CNG infrastructure, because the private sector realized that if they will not provide the buses, someone else will.
Yeah.
Because there's a demand. The regulation has created a demand. So the question is, how do you create demand, right? And what we have seen is that there are two ways you can create demand. A, you can mandate a certain percentage of the fleet to be electric, or you can say, I will phase out internal combustion engine after this date. Let's say if a city has 1 million cars sold every year, and you say after 5 years I will stop registering ICE car, that 1 million car demand someone will fulfill, right? And that's what we call as supply side regulation, which is because you also have to understand who is buying electric vehicle right now, right? Either people are buying for, let's say, a new technology, and they want to experiment new technology, or people who are driving longer distances, they want to save cost because the operation cost. I don't think a lot of people are buying it for environment. But the benefit of electric vehicle is accruing to a larger population. So let's say, why should I pay for the vehicle when the benefit is for everyone?
Fair. Yeah.
Right? So that's the way to look at is, how do you then, create a phase-out plan for ICE? How do you create regulations which drive electrification? How do you also shift this conversation from being a buyer's conversation into a seller's conversation, right? And so, for example, California has something called a ZEV sales mandate, where they mandate all the OEMs to sell a certain portion of the fleet as electric. London is coming up, he has something similar. So the case in point is that because you are creating a demand, you are increasing the competition and the prices start falling. So I think we as a country also have to look at how do we change this conversation from a demand side policy to more like a supply side regulation. Because as Kaushik said, I mean, eventually people will transition to electric because there is no other, right? The question is, should we wait for this 10 years to transition? Or can that be shortened because there's a health emergency which is happening in India? And we just cannot sit idle and wait for transition, wait for the market to take over and do this transformation.
No, I mean, I particularly love the fact about supply side mandates. And, the reason that I really like that idea is because, and my friend from the department, Pragya, is here, and we were working on that project about auto rickshaws, and Kundra sir at that time had mentioned that, new permits in Delhi would be electric only. And all of us thought that, we don't have an auto right now. How do we really go about it? But it took us 6 months because the Delhi government at that time was also fighting a court case with Bajaj, which is, anyway, public. Bajaj fought back. But nonetheless, February of 22, we launched the electric autos, one of the largest electric auto launch in the country, and which was electric only. So maybe a part of your mandate there, but post that, what we really saw was that OEMs started following up. That what is happening next? Where do we deploy these autos? We can do it. We can do all electric if you want. But yeah, great insight that towards the last bit, and just two credible steps that Delhi can take in the next 2 or 3 years, which might be a little difficult politically, but strategically, or it's very important for us to look into. This is question for you as well. So first, may you
Sure.
give me.
Before I do that, if I can kind of just say something about what Amit was just saying, we are at that point globally where we have to kind of recognize that electrification of the transport sector is not necessarily a climatey or an environmentally thing to do. We as a nation have a industrial policy which seeks to increase the share of industry in our GDP to 25% from a secular 16-17% that it has been for the last 4 decades. This is a stated policy called Make in India 25, now Make in India 25 plus 1. And these are 25 plus 1 sectors that the government of India has identified as being important for increasing the share of industry in GDP. And the reason for that is, of course, kind of ambitious like Viksit Bharat, but also the fact that you need to generate employment at a rate much faster than we are able to do that in the organized sector, failing which you could have a very large, educated, unemployed population who kind of, in this day and age, would think that events like the Maidan in Ukraine or the Arab Spring are not very far away. You see what's happening in our neighborhood, and you realize that Kathmandu and Dhaka are not very far away from Delhi. In that space, if you want to have an industrial base which is robust over several decades, over the next 5 decades, it can't be the same industrial base that's driven growth in the now OECD or China over the last 4 decades. That industrial base has to be truly modern and reflect demand of the kind we expect in the future. And that's where electric vehicles become important. Now, to your point about creating competition in the market to drive down prices, that's super important. But the other very important point is scale, which is where kind of, this shift in the government of India's policy from subsidizing the purchase of vehicles to subsidizing the manufacture of vehicles and batteries is an important shift. But in India, we kind of, especially in the policy space, love to claim that our structures are very, very complex and we have multi-dimensional objectives, and it's very, very difficult to find one way of solving this problem. My submission would be that there is an overwhelming priority of this industrial transformation, which should make this policy choice a lot easier. So whether you're going to subsidize the purchase of an electric two-wheeler or a three-wheeler or a car or a bus by imposing an additional tax on a hydrocarbon vehicle is a no-brainer. But for whatever reason, we kind of claim that that's a complex policy choice because we also don't want to start subsidizing the manufacture of electric vehicles in China as opposed to in our own country, et cetera, et cetera. To your point about what we could do in Delhi, that is hard to do and could be impactful. You see, if you look at our approach to dealing with air quality, we've decided that any economic activity is dispensable against environmental regulation. So the entire GRAP 1, 2, 3, 4 is essentially shutting down one economic activity after another as air quality becomes worse. Now, that is so silly for a country that seeks to grow by 7 or 8% per annum to become a developed country by 2047. You can't, shut down industrial activity or economic activity because you have an environmental constraint. But on the other hand, the cost of those environmental challenges is so significant that it might just mean that an 8% growth rate over 2 decades is meaningless. So to be able to find ways of being able to cost that pollution and transfer that cost to private players so that they behave more rationally. So for instance, pricing access to roads, making sure that a hydrocarbon vehicle costs more for its environmental potential damage as opposed to an electric vehicle. These are eminently doable economic instruments that would have a fairly quick and transformative impact in India. You remember from the time that Maruti used to have this ad for their car, kitna deti hai? I mean, we are a very price sensitive country, allegedly. And if we are that price sensitive, then possibly the most important policy transformation that we can bring about is by appropriate pricing. And that's, of course, classic Department of Economics, University of Chicago. Get the prices right.
Got it. Amit, over to you.
Yeah, I'll not talk about pricing because I'm neither from Chicago nor from University of Chicago. So there are a couple of things which we can do. I think one is right now industry is very confused in terms of what technologies will drive for the future.
Right.
And somehow we have adopted this approach of multi-fuel pathway. Now this multi-fuel pathway, I mean, if you look at pure from the research side, sounds good because we'll promote everything and whatever is best will go forward.
Right.
Now that can work only if everything is promoted at the same level, which means you have all the charging infrastructure done for electric vehicles, you have all the hydrogen dispensation for hydrogen vehicle, you have all the ethanol. So one is that you cannot do because you don't have time, you don't have money to develop all the infrastructure and then let the people take choice. So I think we have to take our bets on what will be the technology of future that will deliver on industrial competitiveness, that will deliver on climate, that will deliver on air quality, and we have to stick to those bets. One thing is what will not deliver on this target. So internal combustion engines will not deliver on these targets.
Fair. Yeah.
So you have to look at a regime which is outside. So I think what can Delhi NCR do? One is put some signal to the industry saying that not tomorrow, maybe next 5 years we will stop registering internal combustion engine. We will register anything that has zero tailpipe. Now let the industry figure out what is that zero tailpipe, whether it is electric, hydrogen or nuclear, or I don't know. Put a direction saying that we will not register any vehicle which has a tailpipe emission. So that's one. Secondly, you can also take cue from cities like London saying that this will take care of the new vehicles. What about the existing vehicles? So maybe I will only allow BS4 vehicle after a certain point. I will only allow BS6 vehicle after a certain point. Maybe I will only allow zero tailpipe emission after a certain point. I think we have to give this direction. Because let's say if I am buying a vehicle right now,
Right.
and let's say I am very environmentally conscious, I still don't know whether this vehicle is this vehicle the way forward or not? Because you're also seeing a lot of these, so there's no clear-cut direction. So I think this kind of strategic direction, which has a very tangible outcome, but more important, has a very defined timelines. I think that will lead to transformation. Otherwise, we'll be stuck in this conversation.
Yeah, I mean, some level of signal was there in the aggregator policy for Delhi, where we had timelines and phases. But like we've been hearing a lot about the 2.0. And at one point of time, we heard that there would be mandates, 27, 28. A lot of it was just news reports and everything. But I second your thought there, because it's not just us, but Delhi government as well is thinking along maybe the same lines. CAQM also aligned itself with their directives here and there. But yeah, before I open it to all of you for questions, I mean, I have a few closing thoughts. So we discussed about norms, we discussed about testing methods, and where the gap really is. So as far as I could understand, at least nationally, we are closing that gap a little quickly now, and it's just about how those enforcement mechanisms or say the pricing tools can be really deployed in real time to tackle what we're facing right now. Yeah, open to you guys now.
Hi, good evening. I'm Rajiv Khurana from Lung Care Foundation. My compliments to the panel for wonderful discussions. The interesting part was that 45 minutes into the conversation, a term came up called health emergency. And then we were before that talking about real people, data.
Right.
And when we talk about real people, I feel real people who get affected by transport are the drivers, are the traffic constables, are the khomchewalas on the road, are the people moving on cycles and the kids walking around. And when we talk about policy formulations, perhaps none of those people come up here to even talk about it.
Right.
And which is actually making me very confused in terms of where are we heading towards. Permit me 30 seconds to tell you three short stories which happened to me last week. Thursday, I was boarding a flight to Guwahati, and my small device to monitor AQI was caught by the security. क्या है ये? I said AQI मापते हैं. कैसे चलता है? चलाया. AQI inside the airport, Delhi airport, was 396. I said ये है. हाँ इतना तो होता ही है. Story number one. Story number two, in Guwahati, I was managing the panel discussion, and the pollution control board guy was talking very loudly that Guwahati's pollution has come down and we have raised our levels in such and such manner. There were three other doctors sitting on it, so I said, fine, this is the government version. Now let's see what kind of patients are we getting in the OT as well as OPD. And those guys blasted them. The third case, the next day in taxi in Delhi, and I was talking to a CNG driven taxi wala, and he said, साहब मेरी सेहत पे तो कुछ नहीं होता क्योंकि मेरी माँ ने सिखाया है गुड़ खाओ तो लंग साफ हो जाते हैं. Now with these kind of scenarios of real people around us, the dilemma is, what do we need to do in terms of waking up, shaking up, and making up the solution? And when we talk about policy, should we only talk about data and technology without recourse to health thinkers coming into it and actually banging head of the government and everyone, because even public is also involved? I would like to have some guidance from you, please. Thank you.
Yeah, sure. We can collect one more question.
Hi, I'm Shreya. I work at Dalberg Advisors. I think both Amit and Kaushik raised this think about like talking about how do we sort of increase the demand for, let's say, using, let's say, public transport, right? And I think it's a lot of also like behavioral issue, and I don't think you can solve for it until you think about how we think of urban planning and how do we think of mobility. Are we actually thinking about how, I'm taking an example from Netherlands, how do we think about a map a person's uh, journey from first mile to the last mile? um, how can we, like, if we have like better roads, if we have walkable cities, I think we also reduce the load on the road of number of vehicles on the road, right? Do you think something like that is possible in a very well established city like Delhi?
Yes, I think it made perfect sense for Shreya to go first and for me to go next because mine builds on her question. Um, India is going through a transition, you could say. There are cities in multiple phases of urbanization. I come from Trivandrum, that is in the flux right now, that's going through the transition. At what point in this transformation would you say would it make perfect sense for civil society organizations, think tanks, and the governments to come together to think about a policy solution to urban challenges? Trivandrum, you see perfect visibility and crystal clear skies. That's what I grew up with. But last month, when I went back home, the AQI was around 220, which is unheard of in Kerala. So when you think of, I mean, that could be because of a gamut of issues that policy solutions that we'll have to find in the urban space. But in terms of transportation specifically, when you see the concentration of vehicles going up with urbanization, at what point would you say it makes perfect sense to think about a policy solution there?
Maybe I'll start with the first question. And I think you absolutely hit the point that if it's an health emergency, what measures are we going to take for health emergency? And I think, so one of the things that I've seen has been fairly, again, depending on how it comes, is that, so recently the Commission on Air Quality Management created an expert committee on looking at vehicular emission and what could be done around it. Luckily in that committee, we have two very strong representatives from the public health community. Dr. Guleria is there, and then Kumar is there. And while I can't reveal on the deliberation of the committee because I'm also one of the members.
But I also know the stories.
So some of the very hard-hitting conversations in the committee came because of these two gentlemen. And unless we bring medical and health fraternity in the conversation, we will always be talking about on tangential issues because it is impacting. And again, when Dr. Kumar told us about how the profile of patient of lung cancer has shifted from someone who is at 55 smoker to a young professional, female, never smoked, and the lungs are damaging. 14 years old kids, right? So, and again, this was an eye opener to a lot of people in the conversation. And I think what he really pushed us was that, look, we can't wait for next 10 years. Action has to happen now because you can only count the rupees if you are alive. I mean, if you're dead, what will you do with that economic growth and prosperity, right? So I think, how do we bring this multi-sectoral, multi-dimensional conversation in policy making is very important. And second is that we also have to understand that if you look at the data, right, post-COVID, vehicle sales grew at 7.5% nationally. But Delhi NCR, it was at 8.7%. Yes. So we are selling more vehicles. So let's say, even if you bring down emission, just the sheer number of vehicle increase will offset all those emissions. So that's why we are saying that there is no other option. So one, air pollution is a multi-dimensional conversation. Transport is important, but transport alone cannot solve. So how do you do with other sectors? And second, for transport, we believe the only way forward is zero tailpipe emission basing category. Yep. And that is something that will drive scale as well.
This is the Energy Policy Institute at the University of Chicago, and I can see our deep geekiness and desire for data and measurement and everything. But beyond a certain point, once it's an emergency, whether it's 300 or 500 or anything in between is really meaningless. That's the point at which we are, and we kind of just need to get stuff done. What this AQLI, its health impacts, its costs kind of translate into, beyond a certain threshold, trying to kind of measure that, estimate that, and bring that in a conversation is helpful only in two ways. One, it changes how you vote. Two, what are the solutions that you kind of designed to bring this down? So as extensive as the conversations are about being able to measure air quality better and be able to kind of find where these emissions are coming from, I think we are at that point where we should just kind of make sure that next time that there is an election, this is top of our priority list so that we actually have a governance structure that can deliver us solutions to solve for this. Which is where some of these stories by themselves are, I think, fantastically more impactful than a couple of decimal points. But here, I think there's one part that maybe is important to kind of flag. If we have a solution, a policy solution, for instance, road pricing or congestion pricing, or taxing fossil fuel vehicles, ICE vehicles, more, or some other way that we want to kind of move people away from cars into bicycles and buses, whatever be that measure, if that measure does not actually have the desired impact, increase in the ridership of public transport or non-motorized transport, reduced congestion on the roads, increased penetration of electric vehicles, effectively that measure is a tax on your incomes without having any behavioral impact. So unless that policy measure brings about that change and you are able to measure that change, be very careful about what you're trying to do. And in that, civil society organizations, think tanks, research groups are supremely important. But the most important constituency that we haven't been able to use as yet are political parties. And having these kind of central in a political manifesto would be, to me, supremely transformative. I mean, the previous administration in the US claimed one of its big successes is that amongst the top 5 priorities that it had, listed by way of public feedback, was climate change. can we get there, and can we get there faster, given, I have lost 8 years of my life living in Delhi.
And the other question on the choice is also important. But again, you have to understand the choice in the overall context. Right? So, for example, in early 1900s, where people, when Henry Ford bought the car, when people asked, "What do you want from your transport system?" and they said, "We want faster horses." No one talked about cars at that time, because that's the background. So I think choice is important, but you have to see that choice in the overall conversation. And again, if we really want to improve air quality, then the question is, do you want a system that will increase air pollution? I think the response will be different. So I think what is it that we want from the transport system is important. And once you drive that policy, that regulation, choices will come down accordingly. And I think, so that's something we have to look at. I think choice itself should not be the starting point for the policy conversation, but in the broader scheme of things, yes, it can fit in.
I'm going to take one more question at the risk of Ashirvad then telling me, Shravan, you're overshooting, but because I want to not end this, just one more question if you have any.
True stories, very, very briefly. A large Indian state, I met the minister, whatever be the higher rank, and he says, डॉक्टर खुराना आप बहुत अच्छी बात कर रहे हैं, हमें कुछ करना चाहिए, आप मुझे लिख के दीजिए. So I wrote first in English, then I got it translated in Hindi, and I submitted it. 3 weeks later, I again met him, sir, आपका जवाब नहीं आया. And the answer was, मैंने अपने सचिवों से बात की है. उन्होंने कहा विचार तो अच्छे हैं, लेकिन अगर विकास चाहिए तो एक पीढ़ी को अपना बलिदान देना होगा. That means मैंने कहा 20 साल कुछ काम नहीं हो सकता. अब देखिए ना, विकास चाहिए तो कुछ तो करना होगा. Scenario 2, another state. The MP tells me in that city, डॉक्टर खुराना दिल्ली का कुछ कीजिए, दिल्ली आने का दिल नहीं करता. क्यों? इतनी पोल्यूशन है. मैं कहा जी ऐसा है कि शिमला के पास मेरा भी घर है, मैं भी रह सकता हूँ, लेकिन अगर हम लोग दिल्ली में बैठ के लड़ाई नहीं लड़ेंगे तो कौन लड़ेगा. बीइंग अ पॉलिटिशियन ही इमीडिएटली पिक्ड अप, हाँ हमें तो लड़ना चाहिए ना इसके बारे में, आप लिख के दीजिए, हम इसके ऊपर काम करेंगे. वो आज भी एल्यूसिव है. Scenario 3, Punjab. And I was talking to 500 Kisans in Anaj Mandi in typical Punjabi, and a minister came and I cornered him to take him to show him some picture. Now I'm using Punjabi, I'll translate that in Hindi and English, and he says, "Oh, ਤੁਸੀਂ ਤੇ ਬਹੁਤ ਵਧੀਆ ਕੰਮ ਕਰਦੇ ਪਏ ਹੋ, ਮੈਨੂੰ ਦੱਸੋ ਕੀ ਕੰਮ ਕਰਨਾ ਹੈ, ਮੈਂ ਤੁਹਾਡੀ ਸੇਵਾ ਲਈ ਹਾਜ਼ਰ ਹਾਂ. You are doing wonderful job, tell me what I need to do and I'm going to help you out." It's been 3 months and that bugger is still elusive. So when we talk about these politicians, one way is, hey, let's create a pressure from bottom. अरे मैनिफेस्टो में ही नहीं डाल पा रहे हैं तो पब्लिक क्या डिमांड करेगी. और कितने इलेक्शंस के बाद में ये बात आएगी जब लोग जागेंगे कि हमें सांस चाहिए एंड ब्रीदिंग इज आवर राइट. Until that happens, to a common man who will ask this question, not people sitting here, things are not going to be changing so easily, sir. And that's the dilemma we all face today. I am still hopeful because our next generation will happen. Dr. Arvind Kumar and I keep saying all this, कि हमारी उम्र में कुछ नहीं होने वाला, लेकिन हमें इस बात का खुशी होगी कि जब हम थे तो हमने लड़ाई लड़ी थी, और अगली जनरेशन आई एम श्योर इसके ऊपर काम करेगी.
Thank you. It was wonderful to hear both of you. I'd just like to ask you, so Delhi is, it's in a mess and, it still seems to have some hope. Yeah, I'm born and raised in this city and it's just horrible. But India is growing and there is a huge flux of tier 2 and tier 3 cities and a lot of corporates. If you had to advise 3 suggestions for a Jaipur or an Udaipur or an Indore, where would they start so that they don't become Delhi in 5 years? Because most of those cities that we work with now are well on their way and they're saying we don't want to get there. So that consciousness is there, but because that emergency is not there yet, or it's not perceived as emergency yet, it's not there. So what would be your 3 suggestions from both of you? Thank you.
So let's imagine a person who does not know how to swim. You throw him in a swimming pool, maybe he will die, maybe he will. You throw him in a river, absolutely he's going to die. And you throw him in an ocean or a sea. That's the situation we have air pollution in India. Delhi is that ocean. Most of the cities are the rivers, barring few cities which are like that. So air pollution is what it appears a lot of conversation in Delhi, but it's a pan-India problem, right? So that's one. Second is, and again, I'll only speak from transport side, is that I think because if you look at all the government policies or projections or report, no one is saying vehicle sales are going to come down. The vehicle sales will increase because still we are at a very, very low level of motorization. So if the vehicle sales are going to go up, the question is, do we fight that? Because there is economics and livelihoods but at least now we have technology that can deliver on at least from air pollution. So the question is, how do you accelerate deployment of zero tailpipe emission vehicle? I think that should be the policy for all cities, especially those cities which are in that ocean category, if not at the river category.
So I just wanted to kind of start by saying that despite how many decades that I've spent on this third rock from the sun, I'm still not willing to give up. I'm fairly optimistic that before I move on, I would have solved this problem, and there's no other way things are going to move in my life. But the one very important thing, in addition to envisaging a vehicle fleet which is zero emissions, is that all of these cities have to recognize their infrastructure development is going to be extremely dependent on how they allow for mobility growth. If this mobility growth is private, car, two-wheeler owned, it's a very different city than you would want a city that is not so. And you definitely, so there's something called the environmental Kuznets curve in economics, in environmental economics, where essentially the argument is that because you want to grow, you allow a few generations to pass out as collateral damage before you get to a point of prosperity and you can actually pay for improvements in air quality. That's a pretty shitty way of thinking about economic development, right? Now, can we kind of find a way of flattening that environmental Kuznets curve that you don't have this collateral damage? And that's where you kind of make this choice that you are at this point right now in Jaipur, and you want to get to that point, which is Seoul. And can you not do the Great London Smog of 1960? And if you kind of at that point itself choose to make it very difficult to use a personal vehicle, you already are kind of moving much, much faster there, because then your work choices, your school choices, your public transport choices are suddenly very different. The US is getting to that point now very interestingly. The average ownership, the average starting age of buying a vehicle is steadily increasing, which is kind of remarkable for a country which essentially has only roads. The average age at which most people are getting their driving license is steadily increasing. And this is not just New York that I'm talking about, which is a completely different country. This is the entire nation of the United States where, Henry Ford was essentially like going to drive the entire transportation agenda, not just the car industry.
Before I end it, actually, when you started off, you said before you go off, you're sure that you'll solve this problem. And now I can figure that why you and Amit go long back. Because Amit, in one of his podcasts, did mention that, this is a problem, but I will solve it. And precisely that is the same thought here. I guess I'll end it here. But absolute honor to be sharing the stage with you guys here. Thank you so much. And I hope at least we took something from this.
Thank you, everyone who joined us today, and to both our speakers and our moderator. This conversation reminded us that why it's very important that we demand for cleaner transportation, and it's a collective demand and action for our health, for our cities, and also to push political will to make this an electoral issue. I would request Shravan to quickly come to me, and we'd like to give a token of appreciation to our speakers today. And everybody, please join us for some tea and snacks outside. Thank you.